I've worked with several school districts across the years in terms of designing learning outcomes that go beyond just academic outcomes. And the conversation always comes around to, well, what does that look like in the classroom? How do we do that? How do we help kids develop social emotional learning skills? How do we help kids develop communication and collaboration skills? So, in working with school districts, I have noticed some similarities. I try not to dictate where a school district might go in terms of the products they create, but this seems to be kind of a similar model that a lot of them follow. So on the screen, you see a progression or a matrix that could become a progression of what students know and can do, as well as what teachers do to facilitate that kinds of learning. I'm using 4 columns. Yours might have 3, yours might have 5, but there's a reason why there's 4, and you'll learn that at the end. In a lot of these models, they move from teachers kind of being the person in charge of learning. They might pick the same learning goals for all kids. They give kids the same resources, the same kinds of activities, and they eventually scaffold kids so that they learn new skills. They learn how to collaborate with each other. They learn how to put a team together. They might learn how to create norms until the point where kids are taking on those activities and skills themselves and doing those in a way that is much more authentic. And so at the end, you do have on the far right, you get to this student-centered classroom or learning environment where kids really are making a lot of decisions. It's important to note that teacher-directed is not the bad side and student-centered is the good side. It's a continuum. So sometimes teachers are in control and they do have to direct the learning. Right now, I'm doing a lecture, which is pretty much what a teacher-directed lesson might look like. But eventually, the teacher can scaffold the kids through learning discrete skills, practicing those skills until they feel comfortable applying them on their own. So it's important to know that in a unit, you might go back and forth across this continuum, but I encourage teachers not to get stuck in the first 2 stages of development, but that at least once a unit they get to these higher level activities for students to take control. So I describe this as academic versus authentic activities, and we need both. So I used to teach music, so my kids had to learn rhythms. They had to learn to read music. They had to learn all the language about the music. They had to practice scales. They had to practice fingering. So that's all discrete practice of information and being able to replicate that. But then they also had performances where they took their basic information and they applied it into an authentic way, often with a real audience. I've got to tell you that the reason there's a big red line between academic and authentic is because for many teachers, that's the biggest leap they have to make, especially if they're relying on curricular resources or a textbook that doesn't provide those authentic experiences for teachers. It's very easy for them to move from the first column to the second column. And once they've gotten past that big leap, it's also pretty easy to move from the third column to the final column. As teachers are working with students through the academic realm, they're teaching the kids the different kinds of skills they want them to use. It could be collaboration, it could be how to communicate to a real audience. And then students, once they've learned those things, can be more autonomous and they select the ones that work best for them. Many of the districts I work with focus on communication, and this is kind of how I have seen communication audiences evolve. So if the audience for your students' learning is just the teacher, that's an audience of 1. And then teachers will then often say, oh, well, we're going to do a class presentation. Well, some of those kids have been in the class with the same kids for 5 years, 12 years, I don't know, a long time. And so presenting to your class doesn't really have that level of motivation that it might if they're presenting outside the class. And of course, school or family is a really relevant audience, especially for younger kids. But there are even kindergarten blogs where kindergartners talk about this is what we're learning in class. And so even young students can have an unlimited audience for their learning. And the other trend I see in terms of learning outcomes is that there's a lot of focus on collaboration. And so for me, incidental collaboration is turn to your elbow partner and talk about this. And there's not really any structure to that. I mean, it's nice you're talking to each other and simply putting in things like ask these kinds of questions or use these kinds of sentence stems, or we're going to get into these groups because of this reason. That moves it towards more structured until there's like in purposeful collaboration, the students come together for a reason, because they know their group is going to put together something that they can't put together on their own. So if you're watching this, you're thinking, okay, well, there's communication could be a learning outcome, and collaboration, and we want to add design thinking or engineering processes. We want to add citizenship, and all of a sudden you've got all these different layers on top of your academic outcomes, and that can be a little challenging. I found that the schools that are most successful in getting their new learning outcomes adopted are those that take a strategic approach. They might focus on one aspect of it right now, like maybe understanding the whole general layout of the model rather than every single component. Some will allow teachers to select a component that they want to focus on for a semester or a year, or maybe even the school does that. I've seen schools say, this is our year of communication. We're going to really get good at moving from an audience of one to an unlimited audience. So keep that in mind. You can have lots of layers to your learning outcomes, but you don't necessarily have to tackle them all at the same time. And then finally, the reason I like the 4 columns is that I like to use Norm Webb's depth of knowledge levels to unpack standards. And he has 4 levels, and they're represented here, not exactly with the language that he uses, but in that first part where the teachers might be in control, students are often asked to recall or identify key concept, facts, terms, knowledge. So you can't apply your knowledge of finding the area of a triangle if you don't know what a triangle is or how to do that. So in the first level, we as teachers often do these kinds of activities that then lead to practicing discrete skills. So like I said, my students had to learn what key signatures were and what the scales were first, and then we would practice scale until finally we're getting into level 3 where we're playing music and they recognize, oh, it's in this key and I already know it. And because of that, they can actually think about how might I interpret this in a way that's unique to me. So they're really solving a complex problem at that point. And the last one is really important because the deepest learning is when we are metacognitive, or we think about our own thinking. And so this is true for learning outcomes that are academic as well as and interpersonal. So I've worked with school districts where we have taken the outcome of goal setting and talked about, okay, at level 1, what is it the students need to know about goal setting? What are some skills that they can practice in terms of goal setting? Identifying good goals versus goals that are not so appropriate. And then having them apply that goal setting in an authentic way, like use your goals for a week. And then on level 4, thinking about that and readjusting your goals as you move forward. So that's just a way that I see a lot of school districts think about learning outcomes, especially if they're thinking about expanding beyond academic outcomes. For me, it doesn't matter whether it's interpersonal or academic outcomes. This kind of framework works well for all of those.